Hi, my name is Philip Baker, and this is a review of The Incorporation of America, Culture and Society in the Gilded Age by Alan Trachtenberg. It's important to start with a little about the author. Trachtenberg is a former professor at Yale University of American Studies, and I think it's important to note as a professor of American Studies, Trachtenberg is looking at the Gilded Age in a different manner in which other historians would. To take this book and compare it to Alan Axelrod's The Gilded Age, 1876 to 1912 Overture of the American Century, you see in Trachtenberg's work a lack of concern or a lack of focus on more of the typical key components or key players in the Gilded Age. Obviously there's mentions, there's allusion to the men like Rockefeller or Morgan, but Trachtenberg doesn't spend a significant amount of time dealing with them. And instead, Trachtenberg even says for himself, and I quote, "My purpose in this book can be described as an effort to find appropriate words and names for the powers which transformed American life in the 3 decades following the Civil War. I am concerned chiefly with the effects of the corporate system on culture, on values and outlooks, on the way of life." And this is what gets into the concept of the incorporation of America. Trachtenberg is using the term incorporation not as a business term, not as a capitalistic term, which might be the assumption given the book is about the Gilded Age, but rather in looking at how these factors are a part of our lives or the lives of the individual in the period, how their culture changed, how the capitalistic movement, the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century, how that shifted American culture, American society, American values, and how those events were incorporated into the lives and the society, which is what Trachtenberg is predominantly focused on. Early on, Trachtenberg does a very good job of setting the stage, of looking specifically at the West. So he takes geography, and most of your other books, most other texts about the Gilded Age, they're going to discuss westward expansion and the Homestead Act and the end of westward expansion and things of that nature. But Trachtenberg takes a slightly different approach to it, and I think a correct approach when he looks at westward expansion up to the Civil War as being sort of an essential idea of our self determination, right? How we define who we are as a country. We're a frontier, agrarian, independent people. And so Trachtenberg does a good job of showing how sort of the closure of the frontier, which we see at the end of the 19th century, how that in and of itself creates the necessity to change the definition of American culture, to change the way we look at what it means to be an American or how an American is supposed to behave. So he does a significantly better job, I think, than people like H.W. Brands in American Colossus or Sean Dennis Cashman in America in the Gilded Age, in order to not just outline this as, hey, here's something that happened and now we become urban, but rather looking at how the entire concept of the closure of the West changes the very sort of fundamental idea of what it means to be an American at the time. And so you couple that with the impact of the railroad, which obviously, again, whether it's Brands or Cashman or whomever, they spend a significant amount of time, individual chapters, talking about the railroad and the expansion and the connection of East and West. But it's Trachtenberg who looks at the railroad not just as the means of transportation and shipping and all of those things that typically get covered in a history class, but rather focuses or spends a significant amount of time looking at the impact that the railroads have on culture, and specifically as it pertains to the creation of the standardization of time, which then in and of itself begins to change how America is looking at their day-to-day lives, how their lives have now become standardized. And again, it's a movement away from the independence that you see with the agrarian America, the frontier America, to this creation of a standardized America that's being dictated for economic purposes. Trachtenberg spends a significant amount of time talking about the ideas of capitalism and the impact of capitalism. He talks about labor, the importance of labor, but again, with a little bit of a different emphasis than what you see in most historical texts. For instance, Trachtenberg says that the measurement of time represents the transformation of the laborer's efforts, his skills, intelligence, and muscle power into a saleable commodity. His own labor converted into a market value into wages. So you're talking about the idea of an economic output from the individual. Not a necessity, not a shift in time, but rather the idea that all of a sudden your labor, something that you were doing on the frontier that was for your own sort of purpose, is now in and of itself a commodity. And we, meaning the people of the time, then also become a commodity capable of selling themselves into this system. And it's this system that Trachtenberg is so interested in looking at, in trying to determine what impact the system has on culture and on society. And then even later on, as evident of Trachtenberg's sort of difference in terms of his emphasis, what he's looking at. He spends a significant amount of time looking at things like literature from the end of the 19th century, where he actually says, in light of the narrative, the historical world can no longer be mistaken as hospitable to the American fable of a natural innocence and solidarity. History discloses itself as the realm of power, the laws and iron weapons of the state set against the receding utopia of the rights of man. And again, getting at the idea of the impact that this period has on American culture, on American society, on the individual lives of actual Americans. Throughout this text, Trachtenberg spends significant periods of time looking at those individuals, not the Rockefellers or the Morgans that take up chapters of other history books, but rather looking at the impact of labor on the common man, looking at the impact of urbanization, not from the sentiment of creating massive cities or the influx of immigration, but rather looking at how the individual is impacted. As it pertains even to immigration, you see people like Brands or Cashman that basically tend to argue or allude to, even if they don't intend to argue, that immigration is the impact of urbanization. Yet Trachtenberg looks at the closing of the frontier as an important aspect of what pushes people into cities, and not just a massive influx of immigration. There were influxes of immigration prior to the Gilded Age that didn't result in urbanization because there was still land at the time. Overall, it's a good text. It's a valuable text, especially considering the emphasis or the impact of sort of social history over the last 2 decades or so. And so I think it's pointed that it comes from a professor of American Studies versus a professor of American History in terms of looking at society and culture and the impact of history on the common man, rather than just looking at the history of the important key figures.